Checkpoints is presented by pharmaceutical company GM Pharma.
Mr. Jozviak, thank you for being with us and thank you for taking our questions. What is the process that is going on within the EU right now regarding sanctions, regarding the issue of Georgia on the agenda? Please elaborate a little bit first on this.
So actually right now, as we speak, EU foreign ministers in Brussels are actually discussing Georgia. They just started the discussion that is expecting to last a little bit over an hour. Sanctions are on the table. There are a list of, let's say, 9 people that they were considering sanctioning, meaning asset freeze, visa ban. The problem is that there's no unanimity. For these sort of sanctions, you need unanimity. It doesn't exist in the room. It's Hungary, but it's also a few others that are against this. So the other thing they're looking at is to impose a suspension of visa liberalization on Georgian diplomatic passports. This is something that doesn't need unanimity, and it's possible that a sort of preliminary decision can be taken very soon, possibly today, possibly a bit later. And this is a very symbolic step. As you know, most diplomats have normal passports as well. But it is what the EU can sort of start doing already now, in a sense.
What is the effect of these mixed messages, in your opinion, Mr. Jozviak? What effect do they have on the overall process evolving in Georgia? What is your take on that?
I think, I mean, of course, it weakens the EU standing in a sense, right? Because there's one thing talking about words, as you say, and then there's actions, and actions are not too impressive, let's put it that way. But on the other hand, to the defense of the EU, many of the sort of measures were already taken before. For example, it was already clear in the summer that Georgia is stuck on enlargement. The EU wasn't ready to go any further with Georgia, and they were ready to go much faster and much quicker with Moldova, Ukraine. That's already a punishment. The other thing was that already over 100 million euros were frozen. That's another decision. And then in the end, there isn't that much else you can do. It is the sanctions, but that was always going to be difficult because of Hungary. And then it's the visa liberalization. And then the question is as well, should the EU punish everyone by the actions of a few? And I would say, I would even argue for most Georgians that this would be very unfair, that they should suffer because of something that's happened within a few people in their government, right? So I don't want to defend the EU, but there are also limits to what the European Union can do. I mean, I've followed sanctions policy for 20 years as a journalist, and in many cases, the EU has not even managed to go to any sort of sanctions. I'm thinking about Serbia, for example, that have behaved very badly, and there's never been any punishment in a sense. So while I understand Georgian frustration, I also think that one must understand the limits of an organization that consists of 27 individual member states. It's rarely slow. It's rarely quick, and it's not as hard-hitting as some wish. It always comes down to some sort of compromise.
Then can we say that the rhetoric openly stating that there should be sanctions on GD officials is also a positive thing at this point?
Yeah, I mean, this is the sort of thing. I think most EU member states are very strong in their opinions and so on. But there's one more element that I think is sort of quite important, which makes the EU a bit more, let's say, reluctant, and is that the European Union is still waiting for this final ODIHR report about the elections that will come sometime next year, because the election is sort of really the alpha and omega of this thing. And so far, they are listening to ODIHR, and after the ODIHR comes with their pronunciation, whenever they do that in the first quarter of 2025, I also think that the EU has then a bit more to go on, or not, depending on what the report says. So we're in a process now where the EU is also assessing stuff, what's going on. And elections are part of that as well. So I do think that, in a sense, it's hard for the European Union to do anything unless there is really, really concrete evidence. And when it comes to election, it is OSCE or ODIHR that gives that sort of evidence. So there are limits.
You mentioned ODIHR, but what we hear about the ODIHR final report is that they will not explicitly state that the elections, whether the elections in Georgia were free or fair or not. They will list all the positive things, maybe some procedures were well held, and also all the negative things, but will not conclude anything about free and fair elections in Georgia. Then, do you think this report might be open for interpretation, and what is the overall value of this report in the end?
This is true that it's not going to say whether it's free or fair or not, but it's going to basically say so much, right? So there's going to be a lot of things in there. I think there's going to be a lot of negative things in there, I expect. So it will, though, and this is very important when you understand the European Union. European Union is slow-moving, dealing with processes, dealing with facts and figures and evidence. This is the same with all sort of sanctions. And it will provide certain, let's say, groundwork for things in the future. And that's the most important thing, because whenever the European Union imposes anything, it has to be grounded in facts and figures. This is another thing with sanctions as well. You cannot just sanction someone because you don't like them. You need to have evidence. And this ODIHR report can produce some sort of evidence somewhere. And that is important for the EU because, as you may know, with all sorts of different sanctions, especially sanctions on Russians, many rich Russians then go to the EU court and say, this is unfair, remove the sanctions, and sometimes they win because they can afford very expensive lawyers. So same thing can happen in Georgia if there ever are sanctions, that many rich Georgians can also say, this is unfair, we take you to court. So that is why an ODIHR report, even though it takes time, even though it's not conclusive, there is still facts there that are presented as facts that can be used for the EU to strengthen its case.
Yeah,
so it's not the sexiest answer you will ever get, but it is in the large scheme of things a very important building block for future EU-Georgia relations, whether you want it or not.
On the other hand, we see individual countries, EU countries, imposing sanctions on Georgia, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia. These are the countries that have already taken concrete, specific steps. What is the value of these decisions, and what will it change in the overall picture?
Just Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania is not so much, but then you may have also heard that France, Poland, and Germany are thinking about something as well, and that suddenly changes the picture quite a lot, because you're talking about essentially the three most important political players in the European Union right now. Italy can excuse. So basically, that would be a big change. Of course, you can always argue that, the Schengen zone is like such that you can fly to, let's say, Austria and then drive into Germany and you can still go there. But it would be a real blow, I think, for the Georgian authorities that they can't travel to certain of the big countries. And these three countries are right now very big countries. I mean, France and Germany are essentially the motor that keeps the European Union going. And Poland is, I would say, a growing star within the European Union, which also will have the presidency next year for the next 6 months. So it's very symbolic and quite significant, I would say. So since we're probably not going to get EU sanctions, to have, the three most powerful countries imposing individual sanctions on people is a blow. And it is something that could potentially have an effect. And I think even maybe when these three join, that even more countries, other Scandinavian countries, for example, can do stuff as well, maybe Netherlands.
What would you say has changed after Irakli Kobakhidze's November 28 statement and this date coming into the picture, 2028, both locally and internationally?
I think it changed mainly within Georgia, because it became very clear people in Georgia seem to be slipping away. So I think it was a real galvanizing effect on the Georgian population. In the EU and NATO, I think it was more a sort of a confirmation of what they already have been observing for the last few years. As I remember before, a country can suspend, but in this sense, the EU had already done the work for them. The EU had already said, listen, we have suspended it since the summer. So in that sense, from a let's say a political point of view, there was not a big difference. But I think it became very clear that something is not right in Georgia, and that the country was not really willing to engage in anything, because the enlargement process is the political way of engaging with Brussels, especially if you are candidate countries. Via accession talks, you actually meet on a regular basis. You can just see, for example, now how many Ukrainian ministers, how many Moldovan ministers are in Brussels pretty much every week to discuss various things. So the very fact that Georgians are not there should be give some thought, both in Georgia and in elsewhere, why they are not there if they are a candidate country.
What, in your opinion, is the value of the demonstrations so far? What type of message is that from the Georgian people?
The reason why the European Union is still, let's say, engaged in the question of Georgia, because let me remind you, there are many other things happening in the world as well. And it would have been very easy for Georgia to just slip down the pecking order and people simply not noticing it. So the very reason why Georgia is still in the political minds, in the media and so on, is because of the protests. And I think that part of why, and this is something EU officials have told me as well, part of why it was so hard for the EU in general to interpret the election result was that they were surprised in a certain sense why not more people came out immediately on election day to protest against what seemed to be a rigging of the elections, right? So the streets is very much keeping the media and the political class in Brussels aware of what's going on in Georgia, because otherwise I can promise you that they will be fully focused on Ukraine, on Russia, on Middle East, on Syria and so on, and Georgia would not be in the news at all. So it's thanks to these sort of protests that it's still up there somewhere in the mind of foreign ministers. I mean, Georgia was not even supposed to be on the agenda of the foreign ministers originally today. So the very fact that it's there shows people power, I would say.
What associations do GD's measures to disperse these demonstrations bring to your mind, and how do you see personally Georgia's demonstrations? Is it Russia? Is it Belarus? Would you go that far?
It's hard to compare protests and protests, but I mean, European history, and especially recent history, I'm talking about the last 30 years, which I call recent history, is full of these sort of images. And more often than not, people power tend to prevail. Of course, you can point at ways that didn't prevail, like in Russia and Belarus, for example. But normally and eventually, justice tend to prevail. This is what I've seen in many European countries that are now members of the EU, that this was the road they had to take to one day become part of the West, right? And this is probably the road Georgia has to take as well. So I cannot compare the brutality of things, but let's say that it's quite shocking already, and it's difficult to watch. Let's put it as a human reaction. Let's put it that way.
Going forward, what do you think can make it easier for the EU to reach the consensus and change the overall decision?
I think it will be hard to get a consensus in the EU as long as Viktor Orban is there. As you know, that he has already essentially himself pronounced Georgian Dream as the winners of the elections. I do still think that the ODIHR report will give some clarity of what happened during the elections. But more than anything, I would say that, the future of Georgia is not decided in Brussels and Washington, no matter how much people think, not even in Moscow. The future of Georgia is decided in Georgia. That's how it should be. And based on that, the West will react accordingly. In the end, I do think that Georgians need to understand that the West is looking, but the West is also engaged elsewhere. So in the end, it's not some secret government pulling threads and stuff like that from the West. It's the Georgian people that needs to decide on the Georgian future, no one else. Any uprising, any protest, any revolution, any whatever you want to call it, any change in society comes from within normally. I mean, this is what happened in Ukraine as well. It was not the West that somehow, despite Russian propaganda saying that the West helped in any way, it might have happened because of Ukrainians. And this was the same in Armenia. This is going to be potentially the same in Georgia. It's people's protest. This was the same in Poland. This was the same in Czechoslovakia, in Hungary. So, it depends on the Georgian people which way it will go in the end.
Thank you so much for your interview.
Thank you.
The Checkpoints is presented by pharmaceutical company GM Pharma.